Hey, y'all, I think we're going to go ahead and get started because it is 9:43. I can hear that there are still people that are coming in. So as they continue to join us, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guest speaker today. I think we're all on the screen, so you can probably find her. She's the one that you don't recognize. Most of you probably don't recognize, and she's waving. So this is Dr. Evelyn Perry, and she is an associate professor of sociology at Rhodes College. Speaking of Rhodes, I heard a little bit of Rhodes conversation as I was kind of multitasking here. And you'll remember that Cliff Johnson led us in a conversation about the system, the racism that we see manifest in the criminal justice system. That was a couple of weeks ago. And now Evelyn is going to help us continue that conversation, looking at where we perhaps see racism manifest in our housing system and our housing policies. As y'all join us, if you could try to mute yourselves. I'm trying to keep up as I talk, but it's I'm succeeding some places and not succeeding in other places. So help me out if you could, as you come online, if you could mute yourselves, that would be really helpful. So Dr. Perry is going to lead us in a discussion about housing inequities and how our policies, both local and state and federal, how they have both produced and maintained racial residential segregation. So her research examines how inequities are reproduced or challenged in the context of community life. Her book, Live and Let Live, Diversity, Conflict, and Community in an Integrated Neighborhood, won the Jane Jacobs Award from the Urban Communication Foundation. And when I told our own Kendra Holtz kind of about this concept for this class and where we were going, and telling her that we wanted to look at racism in different systems, and said, named housing kind of in that long list, she said, oh, then you absolutely have to have my colleague, Dr. Evelyn Perry, on to talk about housing in particular. So we are really excited that she is with us, and I am going to yield the floor in just a few minutes. But first, I am going to open us in prayer and in a little bit of Lectio Divina, as we have been doing the last several weeks. So will you all pray with me? Oh God, illumine this word, both ancient and new, in this time that is sacred time, as we gather with intention to be your people, formed in your spirit, formed in your spirit's challenge and compassion. Open our hearts, open our minds, make us soft, that we might be shaped here for discipleship, going where you call. Amen. I invite you to keep your eyes closed if that's a comfortable posture for you. And now I'm going to read just a short excerpt from Paul's letter to the Galatians, chapter 5, verse 1. And in the minute of silence that follows, I invite you to meditate on that word or that phrase that you find especially compelling. For freedom, Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to the yoke of slavery. And now, using the chat feature, I would invite you to lift up whatever word or phrase was particularly striking to you. The yoke, freedom, yoke, stand firm, slavery, the yoke of slavery. Christ has set us free. Stand firm, freedom. Stand firm, Stand firm and do not submit to the yoke of slavery, suggesting that being enslaved is a current threat. Stand firm. I'm going to read it once more. And in the silence that follows, I invite you to think about how God is speaking to us through this word today. What is... For freedom, Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to the yoke of slavery. And now, using the chat feature again, how is God speaking to us, to you, through this word today? We are set free and don't have to accept a yoke of anything. What are the current threats that might enslave us? To understand freedom, I have to understand what enslaves me. All right, everyone, continue to hold all of that gently. Again, it is a cycle, says Andy. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead now and turn it over to Dr. Perry.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me okay? I am grateful and honored to be with you as you move through this really important journey that all of you have committed to. In this moment, my parents in Milwaukee, Wisconsin are preparing for Zoom church at Emmanuel Presbyterian. And so I am thinking of them, some wonderful people and a wonderful congregation that raised me to think about equity. So today I'm thrilled to be talking to you about something I'm really passionate about, which is housing inequities and how to challenge them. I think that our ability to challenge unjust systems like systemic racism in housing, which continues to today, is very much facilitated by a deep and nuanced understanding of how racism operates in these systems, and by a deep and nuanced understanding of our role in all of this, how we benefit from and or are harmed by business as usual in the United States. So my goal for today is to begin to examine residential racial segregation. I want to look at how race figures into the unequal geography of opportunity in our country. I want to look at how segregated we are in the United States. And what I really want to dig into are the historical and continuing causes of segregation. In the next section, we can really grapple with the consequences of that. But today, I think we need to really understand how we got here and how we stay here. And of course, what we might do about it. So let's begin by imagining that you are perhaps new to Memphis, and you and your family, your school-age children are looking for a good neighborhood to live in. You're going to buy a home. Lucky you, you're able to buy a home. And I want you to think about the kinds of things you might be looking for in a place to live. Picture a good neighborhood. What makes a good neighborhood? Perhaps you're thinking about a place that is safe, that is clean, that is peaceful, not polluted, close to parks, and safe places to play and exercise. A place with responsive city services, something a lot of us take for granted, like getting your garbage picked up regularly, getting potholes fixed. A police force that responds in ways that are decent and honorable. Maybe you're thinking about amenities, being close to grocery stores or restaurants, healthcare access, good schools, good transportation, steady property values. Some neighborhoods have all of these things. Some neighborhoods have few of these things. And there are neighborhoods that have plenty of virtues, but don't have any of the things that I've just mentioned. So the big picture is that it's pretty obvious that where you live matters. The house or apartment that you live in is about so much more than where you keep your stuff. And the neighborhood you live in is about so much more than where your home is located. So really, how are we impacted by where we live? And sociologists talk about, they use this term that I think is useful. They talk about the geography of opportunity. This very simple idea that recognizes that opportunities are unequally distributed in space. So the things I've talked about, neighborhood safety, home values, transportation, school quality, these things are unequally distributed in space. Where you live matters, and your neighborhood absolutely affects your opportunities. And here's the key. It matters above and beyond the resources of your family. So often we think about, what does a family have? We look at family income, family wealth, family resources. But as research shows, if you take a poor kid growing up in a concentrated poverty, racially isolated neighborhood, and you drop her and her family in a more diverse, more affluent, higher resource neighborhood, she will do better, even if her family resources don't change at all. So neighborhoods matter. And we live in a racially separate and fundamentally unequal country. And we live in fundamentally unequal places. Geography has done and continues to do the work today of Jim Crow, and all of us are absolutely implicated. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen so we can have some images and you don't just have to look at my shiny morning face. So here we go. So I want to start with, how segregated are we? And first I need to tell you about this funny thing called the dissimilarity index, which is a really commonly used measure of segregation. It basically measures evenness. So the degree to which two groups are evenly spread among neighborhoods in a metropolitan area. One of the downsides is that it can only measure two groups at a time. And it ranges from 0 to 100. 0 is no segregation. 100 is complete segregation. And so we don't need to get into the complexity of this, just know that 60 and above is very high. It indicates that two groups tend to live in very different tracts, census tracts. 30 to 60 is moderate, and below 30 is considered low. Okay, so let's begin with some 2010 census data. I'm anxiously awaiting the 2020 data. So this is black-white segregation. And you can really just focus on the summary measure, but this looks at how many African Americans live in the metropolitan area and how those vary. So what we can see is that black-white segregation, which actually peaked around 1960 in most American cities, has declined, but at a very slow pace, and that it is still very, very high. Now you'll notice when I switch to the next slide, the scale changes. So this is 0 to 90. This is unfortunate, I didn't make these. And now we see Hispanic white segregation. You'll see this only goes to 60, which has remained relatively steady, but is significantly lower than black-white segregation. And Asian white segregation, lower still, but also relatively steady over time. But the story for Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans is quite different from African Americans. They are considerably less segregated than African Americans, but also there is strong evidence that for many Hispanic Americans and Asian Americans, individual success in the version of higher levels of education and income translates into access to high opportunity neighborhoods and the possibilities of accumulating greater wealth. So segregation falls for these groups as income rises. However, when African Americans achieve higher incomes, they are much less likely to be able to translate that socioeconomic mobility into residential mobility. So segregation impedes access to middle-class neighborhoods with strong schools and strongly appreciating home values. So today, on average, middle-class African Americans live in neighborhoods with higher poverty rates than low-income white people. So I'm really going to focus on black-white segregation today. It is not the whole story, but it is the most sort of stark and significant story of segregation in the United States. Some of you might be visual, so let's look at segregation. Oh, nope, first we're going to do scores, sorry. So these are citywide dissimilarity scores. My city is the most segregated city in the United States and has been for decades. You'll see these are all extremely high, far above 60. And Memphis, ranked at 30 for major metropolitan areas, is still at 63, which is considered very, very high segregation. What does that look like in Memphis? If you know your city, you know that red is white, blue is black, and it's harder to see here, but green is Asian and orange is Hispanic. And to orient you, right, here's Overton Park. I'm always oriented by roads, I live right nearby. And to give us some comparisons, Chicago, much more densely populated, a very segregated city. My hometown, and fun fact, this little multicolored place is the integrated neighborhood that I wrote my book about. So we are pretty segregated. And then the big question, how did we get here? How did we get here? And what I want to talk about today is how discrimination has been built into, as Sarah said in her introduction, both local and national policies. Racial housing segregation and poverty concentration that we see today is the result of a century of state-sponsored segregation designed to keep Black people essentially separate and subordinate. And I should note that these policies have been created and endorsed by conservatives and liberals in multiple branches of the federal, state, and local governments. So let's start local-ish and then move to the federal. In city after city, local governments have enacted zoning ordinances that explicitly prohibited that certain areas should be occupied, explicitly provided that certain areas should be occupied exclusively by whites. The practice of zoning using race as a formal criteria was ruled unconstitutional in 1917, Buchanan versus Worley, but continued to happen without punishment for decades, which is why we see in 1946 this sign posted by the Colombians, a white supremacist organization, in a transition neighborhood, which is a white neighborhood where a few African Americans had recently moved. So white racial zoning persisted long after it was ruled unconstitutional, but there were lots of communities who found more creative ways to adapt to this ruling. So they switched from race-based zoning to economic zoning, which is something that is legal and we still see today. Essentially, this now we call exclusionary zoning, which requires that neighborhoods, for example, consist exclusively of single-family homes, have minimum lot sizes, or have minimum square footage requirements. So they essentially put in like a price floor for the cost of housing, making it impossible for people who live below a certain means to afford them. And these policies rapidly proliferated after that, the ruling that eliminated or supposedly outlawed racial zoning. And so the intent was very clearly to exclude non-white people in a seemingly race-neutral way. And because many African Americans could not afford to buy in places with these housing restrictions, these economic zoning policies absolutely had a racially discriminatory effect. So they were racist in intent and they were racist in effect. And imagine too, at this time, like there are housing shortages in many, many US cities as a result of the Depression. It's particularly difficult for non-white populations because their housing choices are so limited. And so they're forced to live in many cases in overcrowded slum neighborhoods because most new housing was zoned strictly for white people through these exclusionary tactics. Some of you may have heard of restrictive covenants. So a legal obligation imposed in a deed by the seller on the buyer of real estate to do something or not do something. So here, white home sellers refused to sell to non-whites per community agreement. This was a major device by which Black people were excluded from large parts of cities and confined to segregated areas. This is from Ypsilanti, Michigan. And this was also ruled unconstitutional much later in 1948, but was widespread throughout the 50s and 60s. And I should note that there were so many informal ways that communities excluded African Americans, and maintaining segregation was endorsed by many, many white churches. So just one example of this, white churches would encourage their members to advertise homes for sale or apartments for rent in church bulletins rather than in the want ads, so that they could avoid Black home seekers and Black tenants. Okay, so now let's go federal. This is really a story about New Deal housing policies and programs that essentially added up to state-sponsored segregation. These were policies that were explicitly designed to segregate every metropolitan area in our country. So let's start with something many of you may have heard of, redlining. This is a Memphis redlining map from 1940. So this is when lenders refused to insure mortgages or home loans or business loans in non-white neighborhoods. And this practice began with a federal policy that was adopted by private bankers. So they created these residential security maps. They basically take a map and they shade in red those areas considered hazardous, as this map says, or too risky for loans. So these maps essentially defined many non-white neighborhoods as ineligible for funding, cutting off a path to home ownership and accumulating wealth, deteriorating the quality of housing in a neighborhood because loans were not available for upkeep or uplift. Meanwhile, the FHA was subsidizing builders who were mass producing entire suburbs and subdivisions with the requirement that none of these homes be sold to African Americans. A federal requirement that builders get bank loans only on the condition that they not sell any of these properties to Black people. And the FHA also required restrictive covenants, essentially prohibitions on resale to African Americans. This state-sponsored segregation program was massive in scale. Of the $120 billion worth of new housing financed by the FHA and the Veterans Administration between roughly 1934 and 1962. So $120 billion, less than 2% was available to non-white families. Less than 2%, and most of that was located in segregated areas. So that means that 98% went to white families, right? Subsidized their lives, bolstered white wealth creation. And most Americans accumulate wealth through home ownership and appreciation of real estate. Today, as we'll discuss next time we gather, the average Black family has only 1/8 the net worth or assets of the average white family. And this is a huge part of that story. We see this also with the GI Bill. Post-World War II, this was aimed to help veterans readjust to civilian life. And part of that was access to low-cost mortgages and low-interest loans. Now, the VA doesn't make loans, but they guaranteed them. Whites were able to use this to buy homes in these fast-growing suburbs, homes that subsequently rose in value a great deal in the coming decades. But Black veterans weren't able to make use of these provisions for the most part, because either banks wouldn't give them loans or they were barred from neighborhoods that they wanted to live in. So in short, the GI Bill helped foster a long-term boom in white wealth, but did almost nothing to help Black families build wealth. And so we can think about what these segregation practices set in motion. We see reinforcements of patterns of racial inequality. We see profound limits on people's freedom to choose where to live. And so they confine Black people to particular neighborhoods, deny them access to loans or investment. And then in the era of urban renewal, city officials condemned these areas that they segregated and impoverished, through policy as blighted. And it paved the way for urban renewal. So you may be familiar with urban renewal. It created a ton of different projects in many different cities. There was this post-World War II need for highways and hospitals and sewage processing plants and art museums and luxury apartments to accommodate the urban population explosion. Where to put them? Well, in blighted neighborhoods. Slum clearance is often referred to as slum clearance. We need to improve the living conditions of these people. So the government takes the right to seize an individual's property, not just for public use, mind you. Often this was reassigned to another individual for his or her profit, in an effort to make the city more, quote, livable. In Memphis, civic leaders used urban renewal to attempt to remake their declining downtown by building a new government center and various tourist attractions and clearing densely populated Black neighborhoods on the north and east edges of downtown. So just one piece of this was completely destroying the Black community along Beale Street, displacing some 1,500 residents and destroying countless Black-owned businesses. This is why colloquially, lots of people referred to urban renewal as Negro removal. Nationally, 90% of all housing destroyed by urban renewal was not replaced, despite the promises made by those who were seizing individual property through eminent domain. And 2/3 of those residents who were displaced were Black or Latino. They lost their homes and they lost their communities. So this is the cycle we start to see: segregate, disinvest, and then displace. Segregate, disinvest, and displace. I mean, I could go on and on about urban planning and transportation and public housing, but we don't have all day. So I think what's important when we think about this historical legacy is that when people today talk about Black ghettos with high concentrations of poverty, and they frame them as problematic places full of problematic people, which are the dominant narratives of ghettos in our country, we now see that they were in fact constructed through a series of practices of both interpersonal and institutional discrimination. Again, these public policies designed to contain growing Black urban populations, to keep them separate and oppressed. And these things have lasting effects. We are in no way disconnected from this history. If our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents experienced systematic social exclusion and discrimination, it is very likely their opportunities today are constrained. And, you know, affirmative action has been for white people for a very, very long time. So if our parents and grandparents or great-grandparents benefited in any way from race-based methods of social exclusion, today we will enjoy a certain degree of privilege. Even low-income whites today benefit from the geography of opportunity relative to their non-white peers, their low-income non-white peers. I think it's important to note that there's this real connection to me for the ways that these policies supported and were supported by and justified extra-legal violence. This all too common method of maintaining segregation through intimidation and fear. So the kinds of things that happened to middle-class Black families when they moved into all-white neighborhoods, like a family in the suburbs of Philadelphia in 1957, 600 white people gathered in front of their house when they moved in, throwing rocks at them and their home. Then several whites rented a unit next door, hung a Confederate flag, and did everything they could to intimidate and abuse their neighbors. Klan then showed up and burned a cross in the family's front yard. And law enforcement, in most of these cases, largely declined to intervene. So to me, this is very much linked to policy. Policy provides, these segregationist policies provided an ideological support for and an official justification of these efforts, these extra legal efforts to maintain segregation. This is white supremacy at work. embedded in policies and institutions, and playing out in everyday interactions. Okay, so this is a taste of how we got here. Now, how is this continued? So what are some of the continuing causes of segregation? First, white flight is not just a thing of the past. Whites continue to leave racially changing neighborhoods. They continue to leave, to fear racial integration. When they perceive that an immigration of new residents presents some sort of threat to the white dominant racial makeup of their neighborhood, they leave. This is also embedded in racial preferences. So a lot of people say, oh, you know what? This is just a birds of a feather flock together sort of problem, which isn't even really a problem. People just like to live around people who are like them. This is an explanation floating around, a very popular explanation for segregation. You know, Black people are really responsible for segregation because they keep choosing just to live around Black people. It's just common sense. Well, sociologists love to bust common sense. So what have we learned from racial preferences studies? This is just an example of a card that you might be given if you were involved in a racial preference study, and they'd say, you live in the blue house. The Black houses represent Black families. The white houses represent white families. Where do you want to live? What have we learned? Well, the studies show again and again that Black people are the most likely of all racial groups to want to live in integrated neighborhoods. Most feel that a 50-50 mix is desirable. Whites continue to be the largest advocates of segregation. They continue to have the most limited tolerance for racial mixing of any form. And now you might ask, okay, well, are these preferences about white people being unwilling to have Black people living next door? And in some cases, yes, but it's often about a no less harmful, but less individualistic form of prejudice, which is racial neighborhood stereotyping. So essentially using race to judge a neighborhood's quality. What are the assumptions of neighborhood stereotyping? All mixed neighborhoods are going to become predominantly Black, and people used to being the majority are very uncomfortable with the prospect of becoming a minority. So that freaks white people out. And then the biggie, that an increase in the Black population of any neighborhood will decrease its structural strength. And when we say structural strength, the big three: school quality. So this idea that school quality will go down, public safety will get worse, and property values will plummet. So these stereotypes, this idea about what Blackness brings to a neighborhood, helps us understand both white flight and white people's resistance to moving into mixed neighborhoods. The problem is that despite the claim that, you know, it's really just about structural strength, whites avoid neighborhoods that are over 30% Black, even when they have strong schools, low crime rates, and rising housing values. Decades of research show that these stereotypes, these racial neighborhood stereotypes, shape whites' decisions even when faced with very clear counter evidence. I will just share briefly what one of these studies looks like. So imagine that you're driving, there's videos that they show hundreds and hundreds of white testers, in this case in Chicago and Detroit. And you're shown a video that's sort of like from the view of driving in a car through a neighborhood. They'd show you different kind of classes of neighborhood. And then they would ask you to talk about the desirability of the neighborhood, to rate it. So some people are shown, and the only thing they changed was the people that you see. So some people saw neighborhoods with only white people. Sorry, these are so grainy, they're stills. Some people saw only Black people in the neighborhood, and some people saw a mix. But everything else about the neighborhood, the housing quality, the size, yard upkeep, all of that was the same. What they learned is that obviously social class does matter. Everybody wanted to live in a quote unquote more upper class neighborhood, but whites rated identical neighborhoods more favorably when they saw only white people in them. So the mere presence of Black people in a neighborhood resulted in a downgrading of its desirability. So yes, prejudice is certainly part of the story. This adds up to Black people not being able to realize their preferences for racially diverse neighborhoods because whites continue to seek all white neighborhoods. And very briefly, this is also about discrimination. So discrimination in the housing market. And you may know about some of these things. Racial steering is essentially real estate brokers refusing to show houses outside of specific areas to non-white buyers. We know this exists because they do something called paired testing, where you send two people out as home buyers or rental seekers, and they are identical in every characteristic except their race. And there's really overt and subtle versions of this. Just some quotes from these audit studies by real estate agents. Black people do live around here, but it has not gotten bad yet. That area is full of Hispanics who don't know how to keep clean. This area is very mixed. You probably wouldn't like it because of your income. This is true of housing availability too for renters, who we find Black renters are shown and told about far fewer units than comparable white people, or they're told they're unavailable when they tell white people they're available. And then a whole system of lending discrimination. White borrowers are offered more choices, higher loan amounts, and more advice than equivalent Black borrowers. And Black and mixed neighborhoods receive less credit, fewer federally insured loans, fewer home improvement loans, and lower total mortgage money than socioeconomically comparable white neighborhoods. Okay, so we're gonna work through all the consequences of this next time we meet, but I wanna leave you with some thoughts about the function of residential segregation. It is a tool of white supremacy. So to me, the function is to maintain racial inequities in this country, to preserve the racial order, keeping white people on top and Black people on the bottom, and other people sorted in between. And the really twisted logic of this tool, I think, was really beautifully framed in a recent article by Richard Collenberg and Kimberly Quick. And I will just leave you with this framing. Segregation was and is best understood as a tool used to promote and preserve white supremacy, deployed to make it easier to isolate, divest from, surveil, and police Black and brown people concentrated in certain communities. The, quote, brilliance of this racist tool is that its evil use creates its own justification. As communities of color suffer under the deprivations that come with segregation, economic disinvestment, political disenfranchisement, educational inequity, and unfair policing practices, those who build and install resilient and enduring racist systems that sustain segregation explain their decisions in terms of protecting and promoting safety, strong schools, and stable housing markets, the very attributes that the conditions of segregation disrupted for Black people. Food for thought. Okay, I think that wraps up my time with you. Sarah, is this the part where I leave you to chat with each other?
Not quite yet.
Okay.
Not quite yet. Dr. Perry, thank you so much. I know I have a lot of questions. I've been jotting them down. Thankfully, Dr. Perry is going to be with us again next week. So y'all hold on to those questions. We'll build in a little bit of time next week to go over them. I do want to put you all in breakout rooms in just a minute here to begin to unpack some of this. But I do want to honor Dr. Perry, if you are up for it. I'd like to lift up the one question that has come in through the chat. It's from Stephanie Rada, who asks, does gentrification change the pattern? Do you want to take a minute and take a stab at that, or do you want to keep it for next week?
You know what, it's something that I would love for us to chat about next week, but it's such a great question and I appreciate it so much. And it's so clear that you're seeing these connections. While I think that some versions of thoughtful gentrification can be opportunities to disrupt this pattern, they rarely are. And unfortunately, they are often a continuation of the pattern I talked about, which is to segregate, disinvest, and displace. So these communities become investment opportunities And if there aren't protections in place to maintain affordable housing for existing residents, they are often priced out of the neighborhoods that are being gentrified. And that means typically economic turnover. And given, I would not ever equate race and class, but given the disproportionate relationship for African Americans between race and class, and other communities of color, this often results in displacement of residents of color as well. Not always, but it takes a great deal of effort to work against the momentum of capital. It takes a lot of work. So I think gentrification, if working against the market, can be something with possibility, but it's a possibility we rarely see realized.
Dr. Perry, thank you. Y'all, I am going to put you in breakout rooms for the last 15 minutes or so. And these questions that I'm going to ask you to guide your time together should be familiar at this point. The first is simply what feelings have surfaced during Dr. Perry's presentation, and what are you going to do with those feelings? Again, not to suggest that feelings are bad. Feelings are very good. What are we going to do with the feelings that have surfaced? And then the second is, you know, we've been given the story of housing inequity in this country. So where do you fit into that story? Where does your story fit into the larger story? Where are you located in it? All right. And I am going to put you in rooms, and I hope you'll accept the invitation. Paige, can you hear me? Paige, if you can hear me, there should be somewhere on your screen where you can click and it says yes to joining a breakout room. Hey, y'all.
Hey.
Mary Lou accidentally pushed something and got booted back into the room before y'all did. So I was telling her, you get to watch as everyone suddenly floods the screen. It's all right, y'all. I hope that was fruitful. Dr. Evelyn Perry will be back with us next week. So I really meant what I said. I hope you're jotting down those questions, and we'll build in a little bit more time for that next week. I'm excited that she'll be back with us. Also, as a reminder, I'm going to go ahead and type this into the chat. We will continue with those racial roadmaps. I have not had a chance to catch up, but I have heard from multiple people that Charles Key's racial roadmap last week was just really a thing to hear. And so I'm, without even seeing it, I'm grateful for him and for his vulnerability and sharing. I hope that we're continuing to build a confidence as we do that. If you go to what I just shared in the chat to the Sign Up Genius, you can see we've still got some slots left for the rest of the semester. So if you are willing to share, please go ahead and sign up. If you're curious, want to hear more about the process, feel free to reach out to me or to Mary. Charles, I'm going to, as somebody that's done it, I'm going to throw you in there too. Reach out to Charles. He's done it, you know, see how what his process was like. And I'm sure that he would be a willing conversation partner. I've got to go to worship, but thank you all for being here. And I will see you in worship in 20 minutes and back here next week. Go in peace.
Bye-bye.